Why do we care about the truth? Stories that can be pointed to as definitive and universally agreed upon accounts of reality are becoming more and more of a rarity in the internet age, where truth seems to be decided based on consensus rather than authority. But is this necessarily a bad thing? In such a world, what would it take for society to maintain a consistent vision of truth? And why should it matter if this vision is one of reality? These are the questions I found myself pondering while watching Ungo, a 2011 adaptation of a mystery novel written by the acclaimed intellectual and novelist Ango Sakaguchi. Thankfully, as an adaptation, it is mercifully loose, taking place in a near-future Japan recovering from the aftermath of a series of large-scale terrorist attacks, whereas the original was set in the Meiji era. This is a good thing in my eyes, not only because I don't like the idea of simply repeating a story in a medium it wasn't designed for, but also because the ideas presented throughout the various arcs are more poignant and meaningful in a setting more reflective of our modern reality. Compared to most other similarly episodic detective stories I've seen, Ungo is much more concerned with the thematic conflicts present in each case rather than the mystery-solving process itself. And again, I suppose the reason why these kinds of narratives are so timeless is because they all do this to some extent. They are an accessible template for the presentation of ideas. Each separate case that our detective hero tackles is a closed system, insulated playground in which we can engage in morally charged Socratic exercises, unbound by the restrictive context of our own world. That is, until our protagonist pulls back the curtain, and the repercussions of the character's actions remind us that we do, in fact, live in a society, and not in an episode of Star Trek. At least, this is what appeals to me about detective stories. I just think that Ungo accomplishes this better than most. It also features actual demons and gods, but not in the way that you would commonly see in the paranormal investigator subgenre. These beings' role in this narrative is that of tools, forces of nature to be harnessed by humans, for better or for worse. And, like all good monsters, they are an important part of the series' subtext. I can only assume that they were present in the original, and considering Sakaguchi's background, it's not surprising that he would choose to represent certain thematic elements in this way. In 1926, he was 20 years old and an enthusiastic student of Shingon Buddhism, leading him to quit his job as a substitute teacher, which he was working in the first place because of the modest debt his late father had left him, and enroll at Toyo University to study Indian philosophy. It was here that he wrote his first books, which were apparently influenced by the work of 2nd century Indian Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna, founder of the Madhyamika school of Mahayana Buddhism. There's a big golden statue of the guy at a Tibetan monastery in Scotland. That's pretty cool. Unsurprisingly, none of Sakaguchi's work from this time has been published in English. They would, however, be indicative of a recurring theme of spirituality, which would pop up repeatedly throughout his literary career. Ungo's characters themselves, though, have little time for this concept. Our protagonist is the unassuming Yuki Shinjiro, a freelance investigator who works only for his pet demon Inga. Due to circumstances explained in a separate OVA, he has entered into an agreement with Inga, according to which he must supply her with souls in order to prevent her from killing indiscriminately to satisfy her appetite. He accomplishes this by having her reveal people's desires instead. Inga has the ability to make people answer any one question completely truthfully, after which she can seemingly never use this power on that specific person ever again. Apparently, a person's truth counts as a part of their soul, so as it leaves their mouths, it manifests itself as a swarm of pink ethereal butterflies, which Inga promptly consumes. I suppose it's sort of an allegory for how being too fixated on finding the full truth can hurt people by dragging their baggage out into the open. Strangely enough, having part of your soul extracted and eaten by a demon doesn't seem to carry any effect. Only in one particularly egregious case does it result in any change to the person concerned, but even that ends up being only a temporary inconvenience. More than anything, this is a gimmick for helping Yuki solve cases, and I like that. It's a good way to streamline the mystery-solving process in a way. With it, every case is clearly divided into two parts, pre-question and post-question, which really helps me pay attention to the progress being made. I'm not the kind of person who likes to come up with their own theories about the culprit during an episode, so I appreciate there being only one or two big moments of perspective-changing new information per arc, instead of a trail of smaller clues to keep track of. I always just suspect the character most likely to be responsible from a meta standpoint. This power is also Yuki's greatest asset in his ongoing intellectual war with Kaisho Rinroku, chairman of a large tech corporation and part-time detective. His favorite hobby is using his practically unlimited resources to twist the public perception of reality to his liking. He cares nothing for the truth, and will instead seek to achieve the scenario which produces what he sees as the best results for society as a whole. He's somewhat of a utilitarian demigod, and has a fantastic reputation among the people as a trustworthy investigator with a near-perfect track record. After all, if he makes a claim that isn't true, he will simply make it true, by whatever means necessary. This sounds like a description of a total villain, but the show is careful not to portray him that way. On most occasions, his antics don't cause direct harm to anyone, and it's not too difficult to see the value in what he's doing. Rather than a ruthless sociopath, he's a benevolent social engineer, with ruthless sociopath tendencies. Tendencies that both he and the series try very hard to make you forget about. This brings me back to the question. Should it matter if modern society's vision of truth is always based in reality? Kaisho's case for no isn't exactly weak. There were a couple instances where I could definitely see a substantial possibility of civil strife arising if he hadn't stepped in to cover things up. Yuki himself becomes disillusioned at some points as to whether what he's doing is actually worth anything beyond keeping a leash on his killer demon. After all, before meeting Inga, he was just an aimless roamer, not even in Japan, let alone working as a detective. He's only doing this job out of necessity, and even though he succeeds at revealing the truth in every arc of the show, sometimes we're the only ones who get to see it. Time and again, Yuki is forced to accept the fact that his exploits mean nothing in the face of Kaisho's overwhelming power. Even if he gets the culprit to confess, Kaisho might just determine that the narrative of them being found guilty is detrimental in some greater context. There are times when Yuki's efforts do make a difference, but the general public knows him as the defeated detective, so named for his countless failed attempts to challenge Kaisho's judgment on violent crime cases. Nevertheless, he comes to the conclusion that his efforts are significant, if only on a moral level, because what's the alternative? Letting Kaisho dictate reality from on high? He'd certainly like you to think that would be the best solution, but if we look back at episode 2, there is a point where it is heavily suggested that he has his goons murder an innocent man just to further a narrative which benefits both him and the state. The funny part is how this is just played off as not important and then immediately forgotten about. Nothing about Kaisho's portrayal by the show changes following this incident, almost as if we're being told to think of this as insignificant. By the end of the series, once Kaisho has explained his utilitarian ideology, it's very easy to forget about all the awful things his decisions have led to, directly or otherwise. He believes himself to be acting in the best interest of keeping society peaceful and orderly, but the lies he tells ultimately cause exactly the opposite. And a few disgruntled citizens fed up with his half-truths and unkept promises go after his life as payback. The way he tells it, his way of thinking is morally gray, but completely reasonable. But it's on us to remember how easy it can be for people's lives to be written off as counterproductive when guys like him are given the reins. Similar ideas are scattered throughout all of Ungo's arcs. In my favorite episode of the series, Yuki is faced with a question about the morality of using memories of the dead to further one's own cause. In it, the leader of a radical political party, Shimada Hakuro, erects a statue to the honor of 3 of his subordinates, who died transporting a terrorist's bomb away from a public area. by extolling the nobility of their sacrifice, he has managed to amass a substantial amount of financial donations, much to the distaste of many onlookers, including Yuki himself. Yuki proceeds to confront him about his controversial methods, claiming that to retroactively assign grandiose meaning to their deaths when they themselves might not have cared about such is an insult to everyone who remembers them as they truly were. The detective doesn't believe in heroes and is sure that those three harbored no such noble intentions. He thinks that Hakuro is glorifying what is, first and foremost, a tragedy, effectively encouraging the same kind of martyrdom in others inspired by their great leader. Hakuro, however, counters by saying that those details don't matter. Even if they were scared out of their minds, that doesn't change the fact that their deaths saved the lives of many others. Is that not a tale which deserves to be told? The cause that Hakuro is using their memory to support is the same cause that they championed in life and ultimately died for. How can one say they wouldn't have wanted to be seen as martyrs in this way? Would deliberately removing the context from their sacrifice not be more disrespectful to their memory? The show doesn't really come to a definitive conclusion on this issue, which is a good thing. If it hadn't given me the chance to ponder this stuff on my own, I probably wouldn't have bothered to make a video about it. That generally seems to be the point of Ungo. The importance of truth, in both a moral and spiritual sense, as well as its implications for the real world. Each arc casts this subject in a different light, but the conclusion the show ultimately comes to is that the truth must have value. Not necessarily that the truth must always come to light for all of society, or even to anyone at all. It acknowledges that many things are better off unknown, but rather that we have to make a conscious decision to place value in reality, even if it's only arbitrary. Even if their actions prove pointless, people like Yuki must continue to exist. People who, for whatever reason, care only for the truth in its purest form, for all the ulterior motives and underlying intentions to be revealed. Because without them, apathy and complacency would surely rule, and reality would become nothing more than an instrument to be played by those with power. Sakaguchi's answer is, considering his religious orientation, unsurprisingly humanistic. A balance between insight and ignorance, moral truth and utilitarian fiction, must be achieved for society to continue to prosper. After all, the weight of knowledge can be very heavy, and is sometimes too much for people to bear. Maybe all this is just conjecture and overanalysis, and maybe this isn't what Sakaguchi was trying to say at all. But then again, even if I knew, what difference would it make?